Hello everybody and welcome back to our Bible study. Today we are on Psalm 13. Psalm 13 in 5 minutes, hopefully in 5 minutes. You can see on our PDF outline our dots are slowly ticking up. The line is getting longer and longer. This channel is definitely not the hare, it is the tortoise, but I like it that way, I think. It's the only way for me to stay consistent. So Psalm 13 today, who's the author of Psalm 13? We know that it is David from the introduction of the psalm. Now, for our New Testament references, once again, Psalm 13, I'm not aware of any references to Psalm 13 in the New Testament. Let me know if you know of any down in the comments. Now, scrolling down on page number 1, you'll notice we have themes, but we don't have any definitions. That's partially because the chapter only has 6 verses, so there's not even that many words to define. Themes for today, though: the temptation to believe that God has abandoned us when our trials persist. That's number 1. Number 2 is the answer to that, remembering God's past faithfulness to reinforce our faith that He will care for us in the future. And we're going to see David expressing both of these things as we go over to our outline. So let's go over there now. We only have 6 verses in this psalm, but I have broken it down into 2 sections, kind of following the pattern that we've seen before, where we see the expression of a problem, and then we see an expression of faith that God will resolve the problem. So the heading for section number 1, verses 1 and 2, comes directly from the text. It's David's question: "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?" So David was weighed down by some kind of burden that his enemies had placed on his back, according to verses 2 and 4. He felt alone. He felt like God was hiding from him, like God was distant from him. He felt like he was left to his own resources, and the problem that he was facing was something that he couldn't solve on his own. He wrote, quote, "How long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day?" Verse 2. David felt like there was no one advising him but himself. He's like, I can ask myself advice, I can take counsel in my own heart, but no one else is here to advise me. And so this filled his heart with sorrow. So that's the statement of the problem, and I think the temptation to believe that God had abandoned him. Now David's response to that temptation comes in verses 3 through 6, which I've titled "David Trusts in the Lord's Salvation." So David's solitude and his hopelessness stimulated a spirit of prayer in him, and he called out to God to consider his pleas and to help him. He asked God to give him life and to light up his eyes again. When somebody's down, when somebody's depressed, their eyes are dull, their expression is dull. When somebody is happy and full of joy, you can see that life, that light in their eyes. And David's asking the Lord to return this to his eyes. David writes this, quote, "I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation." So he didn't know exactly when or how God was going to resolve his problem and help him, but he had faith that the Lord was going to come through, even though he was being tempted to believe otherwise. David concludes the psalm by recalling how good God had been to him in the past. I like the way that the New American Standard Version has this and translates it. It says, "I will sing to the Lord because he has looked after me." And David looked back at his life and he said, God's been good to me. He's taken care of me all this time. He will be good to me in this present distress. And no doubt David used those past memories of God's goodness to reinforce his faith that God was going to take care of him this time. You'll notice that our application is quite chunky today, and that's because I have a big section of scripture I want to read from the book of Hebrews, but we'll get to that in a second. For the application, I want us to observe that there are at least 2 responses that we can have to the perception that God is distancing himself from us during trials. The first one is to get angry at him because he's not helping us, because he's not making our difficulties go away. And then to resolve to do things on our own. Like, I'm just going to do this under my own strength because God isn't helping me. And maybe perhaps to conclude that God doesn't exist, because if God existed, he would help me out of this trouble. We see people doing that a lot, even in our modern culture. Well, I had this trouble, so now I don't believe that God exists, because if God was good, he wouldn't allow that to happen. The second response that we can have is the one that David has. We can assume that God is teaching us something by delaying our relief. Perhaps he's teaching us the folly of relying on our own strength. David in this moment realizes how weak he is. He realizes how he needs God to overcome his enemies, to overcome his trials. And so this delayed response by God is teaching him that and reinforcing that. And that's a lesson that is really difficult to learn when life is easy and when trials are always quickly removed. When David was trapped in his trial, he concluded that God's salvation was the only way out. He didn't conclude to go it alone and do it under his own strength and abandon God. He learned his own weakness through the weight of his burden. And this needs to be our response when life is difficult and we can't escape our trials. We need to recognize our own weakness and recognize our need for the strength of God. And I think it should also be noted that if God instantly pulled us out of every trial, then we would have very few opportunities to mature and to grow into the image of Christ. God's stated goal in the Bible is not to make our time on earth supremely comfortable and supremely easy. He never says that, yeah, that's what I'm going to do for you if you're my follower. That's not it at all. God's goal is to mature us as his children, like a father tries to help his children mature. I want to conclude by reading this section of text from Hebrews, and you can meditate on this a little bit more if you have time, but it shows us that difficult times aren't always a sign that God has abandoned us. Sometimes they're a sign that God is a good father who is helping to mature us in all kinds of ways, whether we are aware of exactly how he's maturing us or not. So let's read Hebrews chapter 12. This is in the New Testament, verses 6 through 11. For the Lord disciplines, notice, the one he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. It is for discipline that you have to endure. God is treating you as sons. For what son is there whom his father does not discipline? If you are left without discipline, in which all have participated, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time, as it seemed best to them. But he, that's God, disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it.